Look like it's currently.
There we go.
All
Okay.
right. All right. Great. Well, thanks everyone again for having me. Today I want to talk a little bit about how software industry is using AI and how I personally use AI, and hopefully try to like bridge that gap a little bit for some of you who may or may not already be using AI and AI tools. Sounds like there's probably already a lot of several folks here who probably are pretty advanced users of this. But hopefully this can try to help level the playing field in some ways, and also just open up more of a conversation around how people are using AI tools and how to get them as effective as possible. So first, a little bit about me. Probably reiterating or repeating myself at this point from what the intro was, but my name is Chris Poenaru. I live in Squamish, British Columbia. Most of my work within software is focused around kind of identity and security. And more recently at Keycard, kind of building a bit of a trust layer for how we generate or give attestation to AI identity, and how they can then do authentication, authorization, and how we can audit what the different AI systems are doing, and kind of their intention behind what steps they take. So yeah, currently at Keycard, which is a bit of an early stage startup, really trying to like rethink and retransform how AI identity works at scale. Previously, I was at Abnormal AI, primarily focused around helping pe protect people and businesses against like cyber attacks and especially business email compromise style attacks. Previously, I did computer engineering at University of Waterloo, and as it's well known at this point, yes, I'm the son of Dan Pinero. So cool. So I wanted to tell you a little bit, or let's say pull back the veil a little bit about like what's going on within the software world today, within tech companies and how people are using and thinking about software, especially in the last, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years with the advancement of AI and AI tools, right? So traditional software, as many of you may imagine, like was people like me and across the industry where a lot of our day to day was spent writing code, hands on keyboard, actually writing the lines by lines that helped build a lot of the systems and platform and apps and everything that we all learn to hopefully use and love today. Um, that's because, and a lot of effort has been put into being able to like get efficient at writing code, getting good at writing code, getting, thinking about it in terms of how it scales and all the syntax and as languages change and evolve over time. These are all like nuances that we need to kind of keep up to speed with, keep up to date with. And part of, being a successful software engineer means you have a certain craft with how you can write code. And ultimately, AI is completely transforming this role, right? And today, very few software engineers continue to like hand write code and spending their days or weeks or months focused on, line by line iterating through code. And really, the transformation that's taking place is that, we're not writing code anymore. And instead, we're more like directing or shaping AI agents to write this code for us. So you can take, and if anyone has taken a look at what's kind of going on within the industry, you'll see major companies are seeing a massive transformation where most of the code nowadays that companies are actually using in their production systems are not handwritten lines of code anymore by humans. It's all AI generated and by different agents at different levels of the stack. So really what the shift is that now engineers, it's not like I'm suddenly without a job, AI took everything away from me. It's really just a transformation where less of my day to day is spent typing out the specific, characters or instructions that the systems need to do. And it's really more defining the shape or intent for what these systems should be doing and letting AI worry about the detailed code and syntax that is actually like being transcribed there. So this is a bit of a shift from in how we think about code and how we write code. And it's away from like, being the author of this code and more like an editor, right? or moving away from like directly being the builder, like hands-on keyboard, building it out, and a bit more of like a director or orchestrator, if you will, designing these systems and seeing these shapes and how they plug in. And very much, this isn't like something that's like, just at the cusp. This has already, happened. Major tech organizations, this is very much like how pretty much anything that's like up to speed, this is how they're working already today. So you may ask the question then, like, okay, so tech companies are just vibe coding everything. Like, how does that make any sense? We've all like seen, the kind of like, uh, you know, not so great outputs that can occur when, vibe coding applications and how does that work at scale, right? And this is really a bit of a shift away from, that vibe coding kind of nature is you have an idea, you tell the agent, build this thing for me that does X, right? And you give it enough context where you can kind of get to the shape or form that you're looking for, but a lot of the internals and details are abstracted away from you. And those are usually where like the problems like arise, right? When you actually go into like more detailed analysis of what did this thing generate, how does it work, that's typically where the vibe coded kind of applications and bugs and issues that we see today occur. So tech companies are trying to combat this by, let's say, like moving away from the kind of like, hype of vibe coding and moving much more to a place where we can actually have like structured, verifiable code generated by an AI and building enough structure around that there's actually some like confidence that we can take this thing, have our customers use it, or build important or mission critical systems around it, right? And how we do that is a newer development style that is kind of being coined now is called spec-driven development. And this is really where we're shifting the focus away from, okay, I have all this context in my head. I need to now translate this into hundreds or thousands of lines of code. And instead, it's more of a how can I define a manifest or a criteria list for these AI agents so that when they're generating the code, they have a very clear mandate that they're working against. So they have a lot less room for hallucination. They have a lot less room for I'm going to take some creative liberties here. They're going to have a lot less room for, I'm going to reach for this exploited package or I'm going to use this function, which I know won't work at scale, but for my weights and biases determined that that's what I want to reach for. And they have a very clear standard. And they're essentially said when you generate code, before you come back and say like my work is done, you must provably verify that the spec has been met, right? And as a human, as a software engineer, this is kind of front loading a lot of the thinking, right? More and more of my day-to-day, let's say like 5 years ago, would be, okay, I have a problem. I have a pretty good understanding of the solution. I'm going to start typing out the code. And as I go through, I'll probably work out some of those details in my head, right? And now it's more like I need to work out those details in my head as part of writing this spec. I'm not writing the code for this anymore and figuring that out. I'm going to front load a lot of that thinking and really kind of the point where I'm feeling like this is in a ready to go place is not that the code is written, but that my spec is actually like, water sealed, watertight, if you will. So that's kind of what creating that definition of done or defining the acceptance criteria early looks like. And this is really where, you know, I would say the separation from vibe coding to this spec-driven development is giving that AI enough context to be able to actually have a successful outcome instead of just the shape of something that may work under certain criteria or, with certain categories or certain inputs, it may do what we hope it does. This is a much more deterministic way of reaching that kind of output. And then again, as an engineer, my job then comes back into like reviewing and refining. But it's a little bit more like creating that black box around what the code is. If I have a verifiable spec as my input, and I can validate that the output, whatever that looks like, has met that spec, that gives me some confidence that regardless of what the line by line code actually looks like it doesn't really matter in practice as long as I can have certain characteristics or certain outcomes met about what that code actually does. And hopefully this starts to ring, some bells or sound a little bit familiar with potentially some of like your work as you think about, uh, looking, doing refinements or using AI tools to help establish these kind of outcomes, right? Most people come to use these AI tools to like either, help ideate or generate documents or help pressure test things. And a lot of times, if we come with a bit more of a bias and a criteria for the AI agent, we can actually have a much more feasible outcome being met. So, as a software engineer, then, like, what does my day-to-day look like? So typically, like for me and my work, and I think this is true for a lot of software engineers out there as well too, is let's start with the intent. Like, what am I actually doing? Like, why have I opened up this new AI chat window? Like, what did I come here for, right? If you take a moment to like pause and actually like try to like reflect on what a good outcome from this engagement would look like, that can really help like give you a solid platform to like start off of. Then we think about context, and this is where a lot of a bit more of the later in the part of this talk will focus on. But what does the agent need to know in order to actually be able to help you achieve what you want, right? If you don't give it any context, and we'll walk through some real demos and scenarios here to show you to help spell this out. But if you don't give good context here, the agent has an incredibly difficult, you're giving it an incredibly difficult task trying to let it assume what you actually want, right? Think again, these models are incredibly large language models. We're talking whatever, X hundreds of billions of parameters. Every word that you put in is an incredible direction to help steer the AI towards what you actually want. So if you skimp out on some of the context up front, just acknowledge that you're giving it a much harder time to be able to actually, hit your outcome that you're looking for. Another angle to this too is also specialized agents for different jobs. You know, when you interface with a generic large language model, like some of the frontier models that we know and love today, uh, they're trying to be extremely generic, right? They're trying to work for both you as AI clinical researchers, for me as a software engineer, for someone who's trying to do some home renovations and asking what color they should paint their walls. All of these things are hitting the exact same weights and biases that behind this large language model. If you can provide some additional context around how you expect that agent to work for you, that role can go a long way in helping it determine the right horizon to be looking at. And then the last thing is again, as it is true, and we've all heard before, always do that like review and kind of like check-in process with the outputs to make sure that they actually make sense, right? Don't take it piecemeal or directly as is and assume everything's fine. Actually do some diligent examination to make sure that the outputs are what you'd expect them to be. One thing I'll say has been a total radical kind of transformation for me and how I've been using these tools too is changing how I input or interact with these models. So day to day, it may or may not surprise people that I actually rarely type to the AI models anymore. I almost exclusively use my voice. And this is where dictation for me is a much faster way to be able to, at 150 words per minute, be able to instruct or guide or give feedback to these AI models, right? So a lot of the specs, for example, that I need to generate for as part of my work, a lot of that is set up as like I have templates, I communicate to an AI agent, it populates those templates, sends it off to a different AI agent to actually like verify the spec before going to implementation. So these kinds of workflows, and especially, finding ways to improve efficiencies like voice over type, is a very effective way of being able to give more and more context to AI agents quickly. I'm not sure what sorts of tools you guys use there at the lab. Personally, I use things like Granola. There's also like Zoom transcripts, etc. Those are all incredibly valuable sources of context that you can then be using to feed into AI agents. I'll give you a bit of an example here that, engineering design discussions. So typically I'll, be on one-on-ones or meetings with my team. All of those meetings we're recording and transcribing in real time. And whenever I'm then going to be going off and like doing different work or doing some design, with alongside AI agents, I'll take all of those transcripts that I know that we've talked about those topics, feed that in as base context so that, I don't need to like start from scratch and try to remember what I said in certain meetings. All of that is available for the AI to use and how it's assisting me with my work. Cool. So for this talk in particular, I want to focus a little bit on context as a bit of a gap. Um, Again, and I'll say too that like I'm not totally sure where everyone is in terms of how they're using AI tools today. I'm kind of assuming that some people in the room probably use it a little bit here and there, one-off prompts, etc. I'm sure some other people who are probably much more in the weeds with this probably have a lot more sophisticated setups. For the sake of this talk, I'm trying to keep it pretty light so that it's much more approachable for everyone. But hopefully this resonates with some and it maybe fills in the gaps for others. So I'll say like one-off prompts, as I kind of like mentioned already. Uh, think about what you're communicating with just like a vanilla prompt to one of these large language models. You're coming in, this thing probably has very little, if any, context about who you are, what your job is, what you're trying to like, why you're coming to it, what if you're asking a question, if you're looking for guidance or for input or an answer. All of this, it's going to be trying to figure out based off of the prompt that you provide it with. So every word really, really matters here, right? And again, that vanilla, no context prompt, you have to understand that that's gonna it can only do as such a good job as what you're steering towards. From a software perspective, you can think of an example where like I might say, write me a function that in this case, like validates a session token. Um, it may do, and especially nowadays with all the advancements that we've seen with AI models, it'll probably do a decent job, but it's going to lack a lot of the context around like what I would expect it to do. For example, if you were going to write a function, I want to make sure that it's like well tested, that it fits with the style of our existing code base, that I can like stand by that in a review. Again, that other engineers may take a look at. There's a lot of criteria that I will hold in my head when I ask it to write this function that unless I'm very clear about what I expect and what my acceptance criteria for its output is, it's just it's probably going to get also like lazy and choose to just do the bare minimum that meets the, couple words that I asked it to do, right? And instead, what I would push towards is using it's a bit of a buzzword these days, but using what we call a harness. And a harness, essentially, we'll talk more about what exactly this harness is, but essentially, this is really just give it a lot more context to be able to do what you want it to do, rather than, letting it assume or have creative liberty in determining what its acceptance criteria is. So this same exact prompt, when given around a little bit more context, can then do things like, okay, I know that you want these tests to pass, or you want me to add tests for this function, and to not consider my work done until I can show you that I added those tests and that they pass, right? Or I know that you're going to want to see this in your code base or your style, and not just something that's more generic and vague. And I want to, I'm not going to be done until I can show you that this style is being met, right? So I can give it the exact same prompt, just with all that more context built in, such that it's a lot more effective with how I'm using AI, and I don't have to, you know, every interaction with AI, I have to tell it to be like, think about adding tests, think about writing it in this style. So what exactly is this harness that I'm mentioning or that I'm talking about? And really what a harness is that this is the set of context that exists around the model. Again, I'll reiterate, like these large models that we use today are incredibly powerful, partially because they're incredibly generic. There's like, billions and billions and billions of parameters. They can help you with pretty much anything and everything under the sun. So when you want a very specific task to be completed, if you just give it a few words, it's filtering out an incredibly vast amount of data and knowledge to try to answer your very specific question. Every bit of context you can give to help scope it down to what your particular task is, the better it can do a better job at. So a harness, again, it's a bit of a vague term. There's a lot of opinions on what this looks like, but typically, and kind of what I would say the definition is somewhat like the role, like this agent. Who is it? What does it specialize in? What is other context that it may need to know? For example, like for me, I'm a software engineer. I work with AI security and identity, right? It just by giving that alone, it can already be understanding the level of depth and aptitude with its responses to me. What are the constraints? What are things that I definitely don't want it to do or definitely want it to do? When should it stop and ask? And what are things that it should never even consider trying? What are different output formats that I may want to see? What are the different tools, APIs, or MCP servers that I may want it to interact with? And when should it actually reach for those versus when it's best not to? And all of this is something that I will generally write once, and then all the conversations from there inherit that, right? So I'm not repeating myself over and over and over again to these AI models. So again, kind of the takeaway here and for context is shifting away from using these like one-off prompts and moving more towards what we call harnesses, which is again just mostly like pre-built context that help steer AI agents in the right direction. And this is really what can help shift away from treating it more like a really fancy search engine and more towards like something that's actually useful, like an AI assistant that's sitting beside you and helping you date throughout your day, right? I'm going to go through three hopefully quick demos. Where we'll actually, I'll show you a very, very basic example of what a harness can look like. I'll say this is a very deep subject in the sense that, we could probably spend hours talking or examining how to build different, complex harnesses. And truth be told, that's a lot of what my day-to-day work at Keycard is building out these much more complex harnesses, especially from a security perspective. But we'll start with just like hopefully the ability to give you guys something that you might be able to start using today. So for ideation, I think, one thing that is probably true both for myself as a software engineer, for you guys as like AI clinical researchers is we have these ideas, we have these thoughts. We want to be able to kind of like pressure test them a little bit. We want to know what's viable, what's not viable, what areas should we focus on, what are the strengths and weaknesses, right? And really what we're looking for here is a bit of like a sounding board, right? Um, and we here we can use AI agents, thinking like divergently, approach different angles, not just like give us exactly what we're that one thing that we're looking for or confirmation or bias towards areas that we're aiming to push for, but instead really like pressure test across a different like set of like strengths and weaknesses for these directions. So I'm gonna actually go through. I was originally thinking of trying to land some examples here that are more how I think you guys would use day to day, but I realize that's probably a little dishonest because the truth is I have no idea what you guys all mentioned different areas of your work, which sounds great. Half of that's over my head. I'm not going to pretend to try to be as smart as anyone else there. I was also thinking that I could do this from the angle of software, but that may not land with everyone as well too. So I went for something in the middle which is a little bit more meta, which is this talk and this presentation itself. So this conversation, this talk is something that we can use as an example of how AI could help produce such a talk like this. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Claude. Um, Technically, pretty much all models have some level of this harness built in. Claude calls this like projects or skills as well too. Regardless of what you use, pretty much all of these frontier models have something like this today. So I'm going to give you an example of like how even just a little bit of context built into like a project can really help steer a prompt in a different direction. So again, bit of a meta example here, but picture myself, let's say a couple weeks back, you're asked to give a talk to PhD and medical med students at a research lab. And I want to think about like what angle should I be approaching this talk from, right? So some prompt I could give it, let's say I've been asked to give a actually 30-minute talk to PhD and master's science students at a medical research lab on using AI in their research. The audience has variable AI experience. Some use tools like Claude. Others haven't touched it. I'm a software engineer connected to the lab, not a researcher myself. What angles should I take? So again, I'll reiterate here that the I fed it a bit of good information and good example. But again, this is working off of minimal to no kind of like foundation of like, again, who I am, what this is doing, and really like what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation, right? So it's probably pretty good in the sense of, like it's not going to be like wrong here. It's probably going to suggest something about, talking about reviews or literature reviews or writing assistance, um, ethical considerations probably in here too. It even, helped with a little bit of a overview or structure, which is pretty good. But one thing I'll say about this is like, even glancing through or reading through this, it probably gives me like a decent direction to take, but it also may start to muddle in this complexity of like, how do I actually take this from, this output to actual, useful steps forward, right? And that's personally something that I've seen and felt quite a lot with AI is it can make you feel like you're moving a lot faster and make it feel like you're having a lot more impact. But at the same time, it can also be incredibly muddling where, you're kind of lost in this, like, was it actually helpful? Like, did it actually move the needle in terms of like my work and what I'm looking for, right? So I'm going to expand this by going in and setting up a quick project here. And this project I'm going to call let's say ideation, right? Or sorry, talk ideation. And within Claude, again, all models share roughly the same structure, but there should be something about instructions in here. And these instructions, if you're not familiar, this is really where we can start to basically say anything, any of the chats or conversations that I have within this project specifically, I want the AI model to first and deeply understand these instructions before, it responds. So part of its assessment should be analyzing this. So as I mentioned, part of the kind of harness here is I'm going to give it a very clear role, right? So I'm going to say like you are a research ideation assistant, first and foremost. Then I'm going to think about again the instructions on how I want it to react to my prompt. Like, what am I looking for? What's that success criteria or acceptance, right? So, when given a topic or brief input, I'll say generate 3 to 5 distinct angles or approaches. For each angle, let's say do one sentence description. We'll do 2 to 3 genuine strengths, 2 to 3 honest weaknesses or challenges, one distinctive note. What makes this angle different or risky? And then lastly, like end with a short synthesis. Oops. End with a short synthesis. Which angles are most distinct from each other to help the speaker decide where to go deeper. And lastly, I'll say do not pick a winner. Part of this like divergent thinking is I don't want to get too biased by its outcomes or have it have an opinion too much. I really just wanted to focus on like a high temperature overview of different possibilities. So with that as an instruction, I'm going to go ahead and um, take my initial prompt. This was again the one without any basis or harness around it. And I can go ahead and supply this exact same prompt as is. Only key difference is that this is now under my talk ideation project. So it has just even a few lines of guidance on how I want it to work, right? So if we compare, this output here against the previous output, again, we didn't necessarily do a thorough analysis here, but right off the bat, to me, this already feels a much more digestible and impactful way of getting information out of the system, right? I don't like I already can expect I know exactly what I'm going to be getting. I'm going to get, what do we say? Like 3 to 5 or 2 to 5 different angles for the talk, right? It's already going to be very upfront about the strengths and the weaknesses for each one. So again, I'm not telling you to like do all the thinking for me, generate the talk for me as is, et cetera, et cetera. More, this is a way of, seeding me with that information that I can make that critical assessment on like what approach I might want to take here, right? So this allows me again to have a much more like structured output and again something that's a lot more like an assistant rather than just like a thought experiment or a glorified Google kind of output. One thing I will say too, a bit of a meta point here is uh, this instruction too, these instructions, AI systems are also incredibly efficient and effective at writing instructions for AI systems. It's a bit of a meta kind of like dog fooding concept here, but if you're at all ever stuck about like what do good instructions look like, if you don't have that kind of like basis or foundation, asking Claude or asking Gemini or whatever it is to help you create instructions to use for other AI agents is a very effective way of generating these kinds of instructions. And a lot of these frontier models will also be very upfront about the strengths of where different how to structure these instructions so that they're best consumed and used by AI agents. Cool. So just to recap again, exact same prompt. One was in a totally just vanilla kind of like prompt without any additional context. Not saying it's not helpful. There's definitely some good takeaways here, but just expect that uh, iterations to iterations, you're not going to be working against the same kind of outputs or same kind of criteria. What you're getting is whatever the model feels like, you should be getting at that point in time. Providing some, a harness around this really helps anchor it to what the outcomes or expectations that you have with how you want that information. Cool. I had a few, so yeah, just to reiterate, consistent structure, every idea that I, bring forth, would we get the exact same kind of honest treatment? So that's creating a lot more predictability, um, in a otherwise very stochastic system. In this case, aiming for like divergent by design, asking it to, really expand and think divergently, not just like narrowly and focus on specifics. And then from here, my job is choosing a direction, right? Like I can then, take this and determine how I want to proceed, having a much more rich understanding of different angles or approaches that I might have. I had also document fabrication, similar kind of approach. I think for sake of time, I'm actually gonna keep skip over these other two demos. I'm happy to kind of share uh, what the prompts that we could run here were, but essentially the same kind of concept. Thinking about, how do I want the outputs or models to be working for me here. And similarly, also then like for reviewing. I'll just to recap what again, sake of time, I'll keep moving, but for these two demos, thinking about what your success criteria is before you even like write that prompt, right? So if you're writing a document, if you already know the rough structure or outline that the document should take, or you know that who the audience of the document is going to be, all of that is like very critical context that can help steer the AI well before you even write that first prompt. Um, One other thing too, I'll say is like language rules, especially when it comes to generating text and documents. If you have examples of documents that, let's say you've written your thesis before, or you've written abstracts or grants before, and you're proud of those documents, all of those documents can serve as an incredible anchor as a use these as style guides for what you want your future documents to look like or to read as, right? So you can take all that pre-work and use it to almost train a model to say like this is what good looks like, right? And then, to avoid hallucinations, uh, we can always have it steer towards being honest or not, if it's uncertain or it's lacking context, not try to like sneak in filler content or go with the next best token, but to be very clear about putting in placeholders where you can use that as like clear signals for where you need to step in and fill in the gaps. And finally, the last kind of demo, reviews, right? And this is really where I think structured output becomes so important, right? If you have a very clear acceptance criteria by which a grant or a proposal or a thesis or whatever your kind of document or whatever your work looks like, if you know how you're going to be evaluated or graded against that, all of that is context that you can be building into a harness so that all your work before you send it off to anyone else, any other human for review, you can be feeding that through your own adversarial review agent with getting a very clear kind of like grade on how, the model thinks about this. I personally apply this for every change that I do as a software engineer, where nothing gets seen by other humans before it passes through. In my case, it's multiple different agents with approaching it from different angles, but essentially a set of agents doing these adversarial reviews that all kind of meet this like, yes, this is ready for human consumption at this point. And those are different contexts, not biased based off of the inputs or the working drafts that I've been producing so far. Cool. Okay. I'm going to keep moving on just because we're unfortunately running a little low on time. One thing I really want to hone in, kind of like, from the demo that we talked about here, that I want to make sure isn't lost, is that we are not pushing off onto the AI agent the aspect of like critical thought or critical thinking, right? I am not, AI does not simply mean great. All I need to do is learn how to like prompt it correctly, and I don't need to do any thinking myself, right? Really what we're doing is before, as a software engineer, for me, this was like writing code, like literally typing out the characters or code to do this. For you, it's probably more formatting or structuring or creating these documents or drafts or grants, whatever it may be. Where, there's definitely some like thinking involved, but there's also a lot of just kind of mechanical work that needs to be executed as well too. What we're doing here is that we're just simply shifting this where more time can be spent in that critical thinking category, where less of that time can be spent on just like formatting and wordsmithing and refining prose, etc. This really allows us, especially within the same, let's say, like 8 hour day, a lot more time can actually be spent reaching for the outcomes that we want instead of just doing that kind of mechanical work, which is best suited for AI work, right? We still own the outputs, right? We're just arriving at it differently. And again, the point here is the thinking doesn't disappear. It's just shifting where our day-to-day is being spent. And then on the note of kind of owning the output, it's definitely worth making a stance here about what these AI models are, and especially once you start giving it capabilities or tools to actually start making change, is where things can start to get a little scary. I'll give you an example of kind of a kindergarten. Imagine you're running a kindergarten or daycare kind of thing. You know, crayons is probably something that you can just like pass around the classroom. If a kid asks you, they want to use some crayons, go for it. Let it run. You don't need to check in on them. They can go do whatever they want with crayons. And if they eat the crayon, like not the end of the world. They'll probably be fine, right? It's low stakes. If they want safety scissors, you're probably gonna ask like, well, what are you doing? Why do you want safety scissors? What's your intention here, right? They're safety scissors, so it's not disastrous, but you probably want to have an understanding of what they're doing, right? And then lastly, if they're asking you for an X-Acto knife, no, there's just no matter what, no matter how well intended it is, you're not going to be trusting a kindergartner running around with an X-Acto knife. Same kind of principles apply to AI systems in some way, shape, or form. There's going to be operations or tools or things that these AI agents want to do. And if those are low enough stakes, the crayons, you generally would say go for it. Don't even check in, do whatever you want. You can just run with this. If there's potentially, more risky or high stakes environments, this is where that, again, critical thinking needs to take place and understand that these are stochastic systems. We cannot determine 100% what they're going to be doing, right? And if there is a chance that they're going to, fire the nukes, that's not something that you want to be, putting in the hands of that kind of a system, right? So for each, for all of us, I'd say find that point where you feel comfortable with letting these AI systems like be involved in other parts of either your life or your work. And then last quick note, as especially being on a data privacy and security background, and especially talking with medical AI researchers, uh, just be conscious about what you do feed into these models. Um, there's a lot of good guardrails in place, but don't always bank on them. And if you're unsure about what can or shouldn't be sent in, always ask or check before firing data off. It can always be very tempting to just like throw a whole bunch of data at a model and say like, what do you think? Or what do you make of this? But do realize that some of this data is intended to never be leaving certain confines, and sending off to especially like third-party or cloud-based models might be in violation of that. Cool. Apologies for the time management aspect here. Didn't really get to do exactly the two other in-depth demos, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of how you could at least start using like Claude projects, or I think Gemini calls them gems, or Code AI has their own set of unique kind of like skills or instructions. But hopefully that gives you, if you have been using just like one-off prompts or here or there before, hopefully this at least starts to give you something to work off of where, today you could start using some more structured harnesses to help you use AI tools a little bit more effectively. And lastly, I'll say, this is kept pretty, this is only just scratches the surface of what's out there and what these things can do. Believe me, I work much more in the deep end, and these systems can go off the rails with what they're capable of. But hopefully, this was a bit of a light intro, and I'm happy to open up a conversation if you have questions about any and all topics about AI. Happy to chat.
Thank you so much.